Good afternoon. My name's Claude Buettner, and it's my pleasure to be host today. Our speaker is LaUra Schmidt, who is the founder of the Good Grief Network and the brain behind the 10 Steps to Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate program. She is a lifelong student, curator, and practitioner of personal and collective resilience strategies. LaUra's new book on eco-distress, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, 10 Steps to Reconnect with Ourselves, Our Communities, and Our Planet, is available through Shambhala Publications. The world is full of disruption, turmoil, and trauma. It can feel easier to shut down, avoid, or distract ourselves to avoid the pain of living through what Francis Weller calls the long dark. This talk will provide a pathway to open-heartedness, connection, and generative action that is not outcome dependent. And now, LaUra, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. All right, I am grateful and honored to be here today to present How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. I am going to take a few minutes and just kind of explain what Good Grief Network is. The organization itself is an international nonprofit, and it was founded by myself and my now wife, Amy Lewis Rowe. And it actually started with the 10-step program, and then we incorporated the 501c3 or the not-for-profit in order to house the program. But Good Grief Network, more generally, it creates spaces where people can gather together in community, process the painful feelings and realities of our time, and then orient our lives toward meaningful action. And we offer support groups that are peer-to-peer in nature, meaning that we're in it with you. And of course, we offer types of training so that people know how to be hosting these spaces without causing harm and instead maximizing connection. But the types of spaces that we host are the 10-step programs. We also have a journaling program. We have a new program for youth, which is aimed at folks 14 to 18, and we call that GGNZ. That's brand new for us. And then we also do workshops and webinars. Right now, we have about 75 facilitators trained in 15 different countries. And then Good Grief Network has been covered in or mentioned by every major publication in the US, but also CBC and a handful of others around the world, which we're really grateful for the attention and the publicity, trying to focus on how we come together and kind of move what we call eco-distress these days. This is the book that was mentioned earlier, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. It is available for sale, and I'm going to walk us through how to actually do that, how to live in a chaotic climate. And we got a nice blurb from Carolyn Baker that said that the book offers not merely perceptions, but nuts and bolts practices for living with passion, compassion, and purpose as we navigate the present moment and a future that we probably can't even fathom in real time. There's a book trailer here, but I think that we're not going to play it right now. I know that this PowerPoint goes out to other folks, so at least you have access to the trailer, but it talks a lot about why we need to touch our grief and why we need to look at it. The additional invitation here is into our bodies to become embodied. And the idea is that we don't actually need any more knowledge. We don't need any information. We don't need more studies. And what we do need, though, is to integrate that knowledge and that information and those studies and really integrate it with our feelings, with our bodies, with our intuition and our sensations. We need to bridge those back together. We need more connection to our inner worlds, to other people, and then to the more than human world. And we get there by slowing down, by creating pauses, and of course, the willingness to feel it all in this really feelings phobic culture. And I have a quote on every slide, and really like quotes, but I also think that there's a lot of wisdom keepers that lend a lot of wisdom to how to navigate these times and how to live in a chaotic climate. So I chose this one from Grace Lee Boggs that says, "The time has come for us to reimagine everything." So with that, let's define complex predicament. I'm going to guess that the people in this room are already using terms like predicament and polycrisis and metacrisis, but let's just arrive at a similar language. I'm using the framework from Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who wrote Hospicing Modernity. And Vanessa says that problems are things that can actually or potentially be fixed, whereas predicaments are things that must constantly be dealt with. They won't be solved, and they won't go away. In hospicing modernity, Vanessa also says that there's a difference between something that is complicated, something that can be sorted out with careful planning or engineering, and she uses the example of a long car trip with toddlers, versus something that's complex, which is moving, multidimensional, and largely unruly. It's also unmanageable and unpredictable. And her example for this is raising children, the act of raising children. So our argument is that we're living in a complex predicament, and the interconnected problems of the climate emergency, rampant social injustice issues, war, vast income inequality, ecocide, and all of these problems become interlaced and basically create the fabric of this complex predicament. So now that we're living in a complex predicament, what does that mean? It means that the way the systems are formed right now are actually not serving the majority of the world. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we actually are in a time of undoing. Like it's almost like we've climbed a mountain and we cannot come back down the way that we came. And so we have to actually get into this time of darkness, this time of sheddings, this time of breakdowns and composting, so that we can arrive at some other side. And I use the frame of the long dark, which was coined by Francis Weller, who's a psychotherapist, a writer, and a soul activist. He's also a ritualist. But he argues that certain things can only happen in the dark, and the culture has been so phobic and so afraid of the dark that we've kind of ostracized it. And again, I'll bring this up again in a moment, but there's certain things that it can only happen in the dark. And just like we know that there's boom and bust cycles and there's life and death, and things are actually really cyclical, the darkness provides an opportunity for endings, which are actually also beginnings, but so often we look at only the endings. And the long dark tends to be a time of alchemical transformation, a time of richness, because as things end again, new things can begin. So we're going to use the framing of the long dark. Some people also call it the great unraveling, the great simplification. There's lots of terms for this kind of descent of where we've been and where we thought we were headed. It's a time of rearrangement, a time of, again, breakdowns and composting, but also the fruiting nature of something being built that could maybe exist a little bit differently. Francis Weller asks us to entertain these questions as we live in the long dark. He says, how do we become skillful in navigating our walk in the dark? How do we cultivate imagination? How do we cultivate collaboration? How do we cultivate fields of reciprocity with the earth within human and more than human communities so that we're not extracting more than can be replenished? And how do we cultivate the spiritual values of restraint and mutuality? So these are the guiding questions that I'd like for all of us to sit with in this next little while we're together. I also have a poem which falls in line with the idea of the long dark in this time of transformation and this time of breaking down. So perhaps we might be able to build back. And it's called Funeral for a Future by Brooke McNamara. It says, I held a funeral for a future I had always thought was coming and buried the world's face as yet. The silence then turned me so tiny. The only way forward was to dream downward to an early day on earth before a single heartbeat. The atmosphere filled with an abiding cataclysmic knowing that if everything could be born, everything could be born. Love promises no less, but a future is gone now. All we are is this. Our way could be to fall toward the medicine seated right inside the untamable fertile grief, remaking things. And if we're in a time of descent, if we're in a time of crumblings and composting and sheddings, we certainly need community because we cannot do this alone. As Bell Hooks reminds us, rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. As we learn to rely on other people, we can have them for support. We can have them for emotional support. We can call them if we can't afford to pay our bills, if a unnatural disaster, if a climate disaster comes through, we have that community support to help us either build our house back or move forward in a direction where we don't have to do it alone. But community support is also really great for breaking patterns and for starting to help us live into new and ancient ways of being, these ways of being that we actually really know how to do. It's just been masked by the dominant culture. Community also offers connection and safety. It offers a place for us to attune with each other and start co-regulating. We're very social creatures. That is in our genetic makeup. Our nervous systems are constantly talking to each other, and we need each other. We need to feel connected in order to feel safe, in order to feel grounded. And perhaps one of the most important aspects of being in community is the idea that we can generate ideas, we can dream up new ways of being, we can have more than one brain or heart mind actually coming together to generate solutions, to generate the next steps forward. When we feel like we're the only ones that have to figure out the pathway forward, it can be really daunting. But community allows us to come together and use group consciousness and figure out the different pathways that are available to us. Okay, so now we're going to explore the steps as they exist. And this is our argument for how to live in a chaotic climate is first, we start with accepting the severity of the predicament. I have a lot of text on the slide, but most of them are quotes. And so I'll read the quotes to you. The first one is by our dear friend, Trevi Johnson, who founded Radical Joy for Hard Times, but also wrote a book by the same name. And I think that this is the best definition of acceptance that I've come across. And she says, acceptance does not mean surrender. It does not mean resignation. Acceptance means that I'm finally available to the entire spectrum of creative responses. Accepting the severity of the predicament means that we need to create spaces to get real about it. And getting real about it is in quotes because this is by social scientist Susie Moser. We need spaces to talk about the state of the world and how taxing it is to live in this deeply dysfunctional culture. We need to acknowledge that the systems aren't serving most of the people and the planet as a whole. And what we try to do by embodying this step is we try to exist between unrealistic optimism, like if we just have enough techno fixes, we're gonna figure it out, we're gonna move through this, and between overwhelming pessimism, the idea that we're screwed and we can't fix anything and there's nothing we can do and we should just throw our hands up and just live out the rest of our days and do nothing about it. I want to live in that juicy in between because that, just like the long dark, is a really fruitful place to be. And this quote I came across just recently or in the last year or so. It's by Michelle Cassandra Johnson, who is a collective grief worker. She wrote a book called Finding Refuge. And she says, if we do not figure out how to acknowledge the reality that we are experiencing great losses, and if we do not find ways to witness each other as we grieve and hold the tenderness of being alive during a pandemic, civil unrest, systemic oppression, and climate change, we will continue to harm one another. If we stuff our tears down into our bodies, repressing what most needs to be expressed, we will die from broken hearts and unprocessed grief. And for those of us who don't want to die from broken hearts and unprocessed grief, we have to engage in a pathway that really restores us into connectedness and restores us into grounding so that we can continue to be awake, aware, and alive, and of course, minimize harm throughout all of this. The second step on this journey is to learn how to be with uncertainty. I have a quote here from James Baldwin who says, "No one can possibly know what is about to happen. It is happening each time, for the first time, for the only time." And it's important to note that actually certainty is an illusion. And I feel like for those of us who have been really well served by the systems that are in play, we have been fed the illusion of certainty. You know, if we get the right job, if we go to the right school, if we do this right, if we set aside money for this, if we do this, you know, we were sort of given a bill that is not actual, it's not true. And so for those of us who have been in the most, like, received the most privilege from these systems, we thought we could minimize uncertainty by doing all the right things. And yet those who have not been served by the systems have known for time immemorial that certainty is an illusion and uncertainty is the true reality with which that we're moving with. And so if we know that uncertainty is in the ether that we swim in, the universal makeup, then we get some choices about how we're going to be in these times. How do we respond to uncertainty, and how do we start to learn how to be with it in a better way, in a more generative way? Again, uncertainty, unknowing is actually the universal human experience. And again, we need to name that uncertainty does impact us differently, depending on the bodies that we inhabit, the places that we live, the social makeup, the cultures that we exist in. There's a lot of variables happening here. And as we learn how to be with uncertainty, it begs the question of learning how to let go of outcomes. Because in a time that's so unpredictable, like right now, so uncertain, we don't know what tomorrow's going to look like, much less 10 days from now, much less 50 years from now. And so we can plan for the future, but also it's super important that we learn how to be with what is right now and connect to our values and come back to the present moment. Who are we now? What work are we doing now? How are we cultivating our hearts and our mind and grounding in the present moment, so that as things continue to shift, we can be with those shifts without being reactive, without exploding at our partners, without causing more harm or pain into the collective. The next step that we invite you into is to honor our mortality and the mortality of all. And we have a quote by Octavio Paz. Sorry, folks. We have a quote by Octavio Paz that says, "A civilization that denies death ends by denying life." And this step is incredibly important, and actually was left out of the first iteration of the STEP program. And we realized that it's the elephant in the room. We have to be able to have conversations about mortality, about the fact that our own lives are going to end regardless if we're living through a predicament. Like, death is part of the life cycle. It's natural, it's normal, and it's healthy. Yet there is a tension that exists between the natural cycle of death and the fact that we're living in a sixth mass extinction, the fact that there are innumerable unjust deaths to people and to species happening because of the way that the dominant culture operates. And so how do we hold that tension? How do we both honor death as a teacher, honor death as a natural, normal part of being alive, and yet not harden to the fact that the injustices are here, and we need to figure out ways how to minimize harm and how to minimize these injustices? How do we cultivate the courage to keep our hearts open during so much loss without turning away, without avoiding, without unplugging from the time that we're living in right now, which is an incredibly painful time? We do this by doing our inner work. And our inner work can mean a lot of different things. For us, it means feeling our full range of feelings. I have many quotes on the slide as well. And one of the quotes about needing to feel our feelings is by Dr. Antonio Damasio, who says, "We are not necessarily thinking machines. We are feeling machines that think." And so if we're not embracing our full range of feelings, if we're trying to push away the anger, the rage, the fear, the despair, the grief, we actually end up muting all of the feelings that like make it worthwhile to be a human being in these times, things like joy and love and excitement and pleasure. I don't think pleasure is a feeling per se, but we end up muting the experiences that are good while trying to move away from the things that make us feel uncomfortable and painful. A lot of times we shut out our heavy and painful feelings because of a trauma response, because it's not been safe to feel those feelings. And so this step is an invitation to start healing our personal and our collective traumas so that we can figure out how to feel our feelings and how to reconnect in these times that are really full of disconnection. And then our last invitation, or another invitation rather, into doing our inner work is to actually start building our distress tolerance. This means learning to stay with the discomfort without turning away, without running away, without muting it, without engaging our survival responses, which our survival responses are very wise and we're very grateful to have them. But at some point we need to learn how to be with the discomfort, because actually sometimes discomfort can be generative. And if we're always running away from it, we don't develop the ability to be with the tension that sometimes can transform us and transform the collective. And therapist and somatic abolitionist Resmaa Menakem likens our building of distress tolerance to like going to a gym and lifting weights. You know, you're doing reps at the gym, you're doing reps as you're lifting weights, and then you become stronger. Well, building our distress tolerance is a lot like this. So we build our distress tolerance by practicing being with discomfort and not running away. We build our distress tolerance by coming back to it again and again. And the quote that I have for this particular step is by Krishnamurti, who says, "If you begin to understand what you are without trying to change it, then what you are undergoes a transformation." The next step in order to live in a chaotic climate is to develop an awareness of our biases and perception. My wife, Amy, and co-founder of Good Grief Network and co-author of this book, often calls this step the permission to be wrong. And I love that because so often we're put down or we're criticized for switching opinions as if that were a bad thing. Like we should all be allowed to change our opinions, change our understanding of things as we learn and as we grow and even as we unlearn. And so as we become aware of the limitations of our cognitive biases or our cultural biases or our familial stories that keep us locked in a way of seeing, we also can acknowledge our limited sensory awareness and the fact that we are mortal beings with only a set of senses for how we experience the world. We are incredibly limited in what we can know. And so for me, this step is actually an invitation into humility and compassion. Like, of course, other people see things differently. Of course, we, sometimes live in what others perceive as a lie or different realities. It's because we are like living out our cognitive biases. And then if we don't do our work to feel our feelings, we're also incredibly reactive and then building on these biases that already exist. And so what do we need to do? We need to learn how to cultivate curiosity and openness and come from a stance of what else is true? What might I be missing? What else could possibly be true about this moment that we're living in? What might my limited perceptions, what might my cognitive biases be missing? What else can I include? What's the perspective of a tree? What's the perspective of a river? What's the perspective of a 2,000-year-old redwood tree? What wisdom does that being have that I don't have access to? And for this step, we have a quote by Isaac Asimov that says, "Your assumptions are the windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in." The next step is that we have to learn how to practice gratitude, witness or notice beauty, and create connections. My argument is that these three things are resilient strategies that are always available to us. We actually have to learn how to practice them now so that as times get increasingly hard, we have these resilient strategies and we know how to employ them. I also want to argue that gratitude, beauty, and connections are our gateways into meaning making and joy. And again, the meaning making and the joy and the pleasure, the love, the connection, these kinds of things are why we're alive. It makes life worth living. And so this step is all about our whys. Like, what are your whys that keep you going in tough times? Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust, who was also a psychiatrist, taught that those who have a why to live, we can endure almost anyhow. So this is a question of what are your whys? What brings you back to the present moment? What fills you with joy and connection? And how do you notice what's still here? Because so much about the crises, the predicament that we're facing is about what we're losing and what will be lost and what is already lost and who's suffering and how much suffering is there. But where are those pockets of beauty and joy? Where are those pockets of connection that still exist? And I have a quote from Rachel Carson that says, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." The next step is about taking breaks and resting. The world wants so much from us. This dominant culture wants so much from us that it erodes us. It erodes our capacity to connect. It erodes our capacity to feel our feelings and be embodied and do our trauma work and all the things that we need to be doing to be our healthiest versions of ourselves. And so we lean on this quote by Audre Lorde that says, "Caring for myself is not a self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." And the idea is that rest is a human right. And this dominant culture, this capitalistic way of being, denies us the right to rest unless we've earned it, unless we've done enough, unless we've worked enough. But actually, rest is a really generative practice. We learn a lot from resting. Most of our best ideas come from being well rested. And in my research, I have learned from Dr. Dalton Smith that there are actually 7 types of rest. And most of the time we focus on physical rest, which is only one of 7 types. And this is the type of like, take a nap, get 8 hours of sleep, but there's also mental rest. There's sensory rest, creative rest, emotional rest, social rest, and spiritual rest. And if you look up Dr. Dalton Smith, or if you buy the book and read through it, we provide a number of different examples of the way that you can achieve rest in all these 7 categories. We also really lean on the wisdom of Bayo Kamalafe, who says times are urgent, let us slow down, which seems like the exact opposite thing that we ought to be doing if we're in a crisis. And yet, if we continuously embody crisis mindset, what kind of solutions, what kind of steps are we taking from the place of crisis? Yet, if we can slow down, if we become mindful, if we become connected, our actions become more clear. Our actions become a bit wiser and imbued with an actual sensitivity to the moment, sensitivity to the future that a crisis won't have. And it's important to note that in order to actually take a break and rest, that we need a community. And we use the analogy, which was brought to us by one of our 10 steppers, of being a part of a band or a choir. When I'm a part of a band, if I'm playing my saxophone, I'm not responsible for carrying the melody by myself. I am one instrument that is helping to bring a beautiful melody out with the help of my bandmates. And sometimes I have to rest for a few bars, and then the other band continues to play and still creates the melody. And then I come in with my part, and then other people get to rest. And so true break taking and rest can happen, but only if we have the community to step up as we step out. The next step is maybe one of the hardest, and that's to grieve the harm I've caused. We have a quote from Angela Davis that says, "Walls turned sideways are bridges." And this step acknowledges that to be alive, to be part of the human experience, means that we're all harm doers and harm receivers. And that the power over systems that we live in create systems of impossible choices, which means that I often feel like damned if I do and damned if I don't. Do I buy organic, but it costs a lot more? Or do I buy something wrapped in plastic? Do I do this or do I do this? Like, it just is constantly feeling like I can never be the person that I want to be and minimize the harm in the way that I want to, because the system makes it impossible. It's either inaccessible, or it's not affordable, or it's not available, or everything is made out of plastic, you know? There are just so many ways that we're just harming each other and the planet because the system is designed to do that. The system is designed for harm. And so this step is an invitation to actually slow down and to tap into the grief that comes because we are all harm doers. And actually, we can't feel the grief from our harm doing if we're not slowing down to see the impacts of our harm. And once we do that, we can start to heal by moving toward accountability. What does accountability look like for each of us? What does remorse look like? And then what does repair look like? Is there a possibility to minimize harm in the future when we're encountering a similar situation? Is there a different pathway that's opened? This step is also a place where we can realize the intergenerational trauma and the different impacts of trauma on us. And again, the bodies we're born in, the cultures we inhabit, the places we live. There's so many different iterations of trauma that are coming down on us that impact us differently. But the idea is that we all have trauma, and that it's inherited, and that it's been continuing for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it is our responsibility to start healing that trauma. And we do it by transforming our inner worlds and saying, I'm not going to keep doing this harm. A lot of the harm that happens, a lot of these cultural biases that we're living with they play on through us. We embody them and we act them out. And this is the step where we can come and we can say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to find a different way. I'm going to learn how to act differently. I'm going to learn how to behave differently. And as we know from systems theory, I, as an individual, when I change, I impact the systems around me, and then maybe the people around me change. And that actually is how we can have the ripple effect and start transforming the people around us, the world around us. The ninth step is show up. And what does it mean to show up? This step is an invitation into authenticity and vulnerability. Like, who are you at your core? Who are you before the dominant culture told you who to be and what to expect and how to show up? Similarly, where is your energy best placed? How many times do you show up because you think you have to, or because you're afraid of the criticism of the people around you? What are your intentions of showing up? What is your quality of showing up? When you show up, when you make a dedicated stance to show up in your life, what does it feel like? How are you showing up? Are you fully present in your showing up? This step is also a lot about cultivating and honoring your personal and collective boundaries. What are you doing to ensure that you're taking care of yourself so you can show up, so you can be authentic and vulnerable, so your quality of showing up can be holistic? And then in what ways are you showing up for your community? We have a quote from Neil Gaiman, and it says, "The moment that you feel that just possibly you're walking down the street naked, exposing too much of your heart and your mind and what exists on the inside, showing too much of yourself, that's the moment you might be starting to get it right." And this step is a plea for us to connect at the level of authenticity and vulnerability. And so many of us have forgotten how to do it. The dominant culture is hyper individualistic, it's competitive, and by nature, it disconnects us. To actually show up, to be seen, and to start to see others is a revolutionary healing act. And then finally, the last step of how to live in a chaotic climate is to reinvest into meaningful action. And this meaningful action can be different for you than it is for me, and it ought to be, because your skills and your passions and your experiences are different than mine. So you're going to have different superpowers than I am. And what you can do is you can start to invest your superpowers in a way that generates life, that contributes to healing, that contributes to connection and to growth. And when you've worked all of these steps, when you're practicing them on the day-to-day, you can start to notice what types of openness, what type of energy and insight is available now that you've gone through the other steps, now that you're accepting the severity of the predicament and you're being with uncertainty and you're doing all of these things to kind of acknowledge the state of the world, but also acknowledge your responses to it. These actions, hopefully at this point, are created from compassion and insight instead of egocentric motivations or instead of thoughtlessness, which so many of us are engaging in because of this rat race dominant culture that we're stuck in. We just, we wake up and we go to work and we try to survive and we pay our bills and then we come home tired and we go to bed and we do the next thing the next day. Like, how do we start finding ways to interrupt that monotony and interrupt these cycles? There's a quote by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, which I absolutely love and use on my email signature, that says, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach." So these are our 10 steps. Here is the arc a little more closely. We went through all of them. This is, again, our argument for how to live in a chaotic climate, accept the severity of the predicament, be with uncertainty, honor my mortality and the mortality of all. We need to do our inner work. We need to develop awareness of biases and perception. And then, of course, we move to practicing gratitude, witnessing beauty, and creating connections. But then we move to taking breaks and resting. We grieve the harm we've caused. We show up. We reinvest into meaningful efforts. And so what's next? Say we're practicing all of these things. What do we do now? And I don't know. We don't know. None of us know. It's impossible to know. We've never been here before as a species. Of course, we have things like the IPCC, we have reports, we have scientists doing great work. We have a lot of knowledge, but we actually don't know what's actually possible. And what our argument is at Good Grief Network, what Amy's and my argument is that it is our job to stay open and curious and connected, because we might be planting seeds for new paradigms that are just in life focus, even if we can't get there. We need to be holding the seeds of these new paradigms because we don't know what comes next. We don't know what iteration of life is going to take hold after the long dark. What are we doing to carry the embodied knowledge of connection, of reciprocity, of mutuality, of life, of justice? And how do we do it without holding to getting these answers in this lifetime? What are our core values? What are we committed to in this life? I love the quote by Joanna Macy that's here on the top of the slide that says, when you're in the middle of a big adventure, you don't have time to decide whether you're hopeful or hopeless. All of your energy should be right here in the moment. All of your energy should be right here in the moment. And then, in order for us to do all of this work, in order for us to have these seeds in our pockets for future paradigms that may or may not come about, but certainly will not come about if we're not planting any seeds, is that we need to engage in daily practices. We call them grounding exercises. But somatics teaches us that we're always practicing something. Our attention is always going somewhere. And so how do we be more intentional about the things we're doing with our days? How do we help our nervous system know what's safe and how to be regulated and how to calm down and how to come back into our window of tolerance? How do we allow for responses instead of reactivity? What kinds of practices are you engaging in daily? And here are just a handful of practices that we employ in Good Grief Network. We use mindfulness and meditation practices. There's Tonglen meditation. There's loving kindness meditation. We do orientation exercises. Our favorite one is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 that engages all of our senses and brings us back into the moment. We have embodiment exercises that gets us feeling into our body, gets us touching into our body and noticing our sensations. We have breathing exercises. My personal favorite is 4-7-8 breathing. It's a patterned breathing that really helps reduce feelings of anxiety. And then we have exploratory exercises, things like journaling or identifying our resources so that as we start to feel overwhelmed, we know who our sources of support are and our places of support. And as I'm starting to close out my part of the presentation, we do have several upcoming offerings, both from Good Grief and myself individually. Good Grief Network, we actually work these 10 steps together, and we come together once a week for 2 hours a week, and we support each other as we explore those 10 steps that we just engaged with. And we have several programs that are already lined up for 2024, and we'll have several more throughout the year. My wife and I are going to be hosting our flow facilitation training, which is a 12-week course. And it not only talks about why the 10 steps are as they are, but also teaches the best practices for holding these potentially emotionally laden spaces. That class will run from February to May, and applications are open for it right now. So if you are interested in this modality, or if you're interested in holding space for others and minimizing harm and maximizing connection, go ahead and apply for this course. And then I'm also joining with 6 other facilitators for a weekly offering of workshops on Wednesdays and Thursdays called The Rest of Activism. And you are welcome to join us if this kind of work is interesting to you. I do have a discount code for 15 UK dollars a month, and you can click that link, and I believe that the PDF will be circulated. So if you can't, take a screenshot or you can't get this directly, I think you'll have access to the PDFs later. And then, of course, the typical ways to connect with us, we're on all the social media channels, but I do want to highlight that the book, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, does have a Spotify playlist that Amy Lewis Rowe made. We're super proud of it, and you can listen to it as you read, you can listen to it as you go about your day. And every chapter, it starts with the community chapter, has 3 songs. And so it goes through the 10 steps, but also the community chapter, 3 songs each. And it's a really great listening experience for you. And we in Good Grief Network use a lot of poetry because I think that it helps us touch this liminal space, this space of in-betweens, the space of almost wordlessness by using words. And so I'm going to read one more poem and then we'll open it up to questions. This poem is called On Another Panel About Climate. They asked me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem. This poem is by Aisha Siddiqa, and she is a youth activist. What if the future is soft and revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight? Whole cities breathe and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promised to no one, as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher yet. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful it is that we exist. What if we stun existence one more time? When I wake up, get out of bed, my 7-year-old cousin with her ruptured belly tags along. Then follows my grandmother, aunts, and my cousins and the violent shape of their drinking water. The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of earth and we are nobodies. Been born from so many apocalypses, what's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. But for what it's worth, I'd do this again. Gamble on humanity 100 times over. Commit to life onto life as the trees fall and take us with them. I'd follow love into extinction. All right, folks, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm grateful to answer any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I loved all of your quotes. I think I'm going to watch the whole thing all over again just to get the quotes. But turning to the chat and taking people more or less in order. First of all, I'm going to say that Paul Beckwith is on deck, but the first question goes to David Pollock. Pollock, David, can you unmute yourself and turn on, there we go. Turn on your video.
There we go. Laura, thank you. That was great. Really enjoyed it. I'm hesitating because questions were just emerging right at the end, but I typed one in right at the very beginning. You know, as someone involved with KCOR, this organization, for quite a long time, I was really interested at the very beginning in a little bit more of the story of your organization. Like, I don't know how long you've been going and how much funding you needed to get going and how it really took off and how you got that media attention that you have. So any reflection on that, but maybe I could marry it to my very last question, which is when we talk about needing community, I agree, and I've been a part of lots of different communities over sort of my working life. After the pandemic and during even now, COVID, I find at an older age, physical community really much more difficult, and electronic communities really quite unsatisfying in many respects. And I just was interested in your thoughts about the significance of being in physical proximity to one another with the kind of work you're talking about, as opposed to just being on Zoom meetings. So two-part question there, and thank you again.
Thank you for the questions, David. The first question to answer blatantly is a little bit of luck is how we got so big, and a lot of perseverance by my wife and me. I've been doing this work indirectly, I'd argue probably my whole life. But it really started in my graduate work in 2013 to 2015. I was really doing resilience building work and looking into the available research. And from that, I created kind of the roadmap that would then become the steps. And we didn't create kind of the first Good Grief meetings until 2016. Running through the first step program in early 2017, but we started getting media attention very quickly, starting in 2016. And the transparent part of the story is that I followed Yale Climate Connections and was getting inundated by like the overwhelming news about climate. You know, they had those daily feeds of like, here's the roundup of all this news. And it was like depressing news, coral reefs dying, you know, all the things that so many of us are hyper aware of in this space. And so they asked at the bottom of one of the emails, like, what are we missing? And I responded and I said, I think you're missing the component of grief and what it's like to receive this news daily. And like, what are we supposed to do with it? And then they responded and they said, do you have anything to say about that? And I responded and said, I sure do. I've been doing some research on it for a little while. And then they became instantly fascinated by the STEP program and how to move through the world with open hearts and, not shut down to these things. And then from there, other people just thought it was such a novel approach that we would be meeting collectively to talk about our griefs for the world. I think some people thought it was foolish as well. We got a lot of criticism of like, oh, there's so many things in the world happening and you're meeting about your collective grief over the state of the world. And so we just kept going and kept trying to build. And actually, to be honest, again, we thought it would stay very small and in Salt Lake City, which is where it started. And we thought it would just be support for us and our community of change makers there. But after we ran through the program twice, we got feedback that it was transformative for a lot of the people and that they wanted us to scale it up and to build it. And to answer your question about funding, we were actually not funded. My wife and I did this as volunteers for a number of years. We sacrificed our own expenses, cashed in our retirements, and just did all the things to keep this little organization afloat and try to build it, which is not wise. It's not a wise way to build an organization. And luckily in the past few years, we've had another person step up and become a full-time staffer for us. And she's written us some grants and she's been able to bring in some grants for us. And again, transparency is what we do at Good Grief Network. We're still not a stable nonprofit. We're not stably funded. We do have a number of grants that come in, but not in the way that we would need to be fiscally.
What was the organization where you posted your response?
Oh, Yale Climate Connections.
Oh, okay. Got it. And all of the media, did you go after it or it came to you?
They came to us. So right after Yale Climate Connections, we had an NPR, a local NPR person figure out what we were doing. And so then she interviewed us for local NPR, and then also it went to national NPR. And then when other people started feeling eco-anxiety and grief, you would just Google those terms like climate grief or eco-anxiety, and we ended up being one of the covered, one of the groups covered. So then other people would reach out to us. And so that's where the little bit of luck comes in, is I think the media follows the media. And if you're in the media already,
sure.
And then you can answer questions, with nice sound bites that make it into the pieces, then they continue to follow you. But yeah, putting out a podcast and putting out a few different types of pieces of writing. And then of course the book allows us to be viable candidates for media interviews, but almost always they've come to us, which I feel really lucky about.
It's a lovely journey that you've described. So thanks. And what about the reference to physical proximity? What's your thinking there?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for reminding me about that question. Good Grief Network started as an in-person group, and then we went digital a bit before the COVID lockdowns, and we have been primarily digital since then. But I think that we need to be really expansive in our definition of community, because digital community is brilliant and it offers a lot of things. And I too find it lacking, there's nothing like being in person and connecting with people over a cup of tea and having that discussion with people. So the digital realm is a gift and we need in-person connection. And, I hear that sometimes it might be difficult to build that in-person connection. I feel the same way. I moved back to Michigan after being away for 15 years, and I'm living in a new part of Michigan, and I have social anxiety. And then with COVID, I actually have COVID right now. And so it always feels like a risk to get out into the community and meet new people. And so I know the importance. I know that when catastrophes hit, we need to have those relationships in person. I know we need to know our neighbors. And so I've been trying to just get into local farmers markets, or, speaking things that seem like there might be ideologically aligned people there, and start making connections that way. But it has been really hard. And so I don't know, for me, in-person community, knowing that it's a necessity, it's still hard to go and build it and cultivate it. And I think a lot of it is this hyper individualism and the social breakdown that's happening. And so it really comes back to trust and learning how to trust people again, learning how to communicate with people even through differences, Like, we don't have to be 100% ideologically aligned in order to trust people, you know? So I guess that's my 2 cents about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it was 3 cents.
And that's a timely, Lalit, you are on deck, and now Paul Beckwith has the floor.
Yes, thank you, LaUra. Fascinating presentation. And I guess I have to ask you, is there a story behind the capital U in your first name? That's an aside question. I just, looking at the science of climate change and seeing the politics, especially in the US and, other places around the world getting far right governments and protectionism. And I think it's all related to climate change, as we lack resources, countries turn inward, et cetera. So you mentioned, why there's all of these predicaments occurring now. And, I would argue that we should enjoy ourselves now. I mean, we're living in great times right now. I think in 5 or 10 years, things are going to be much, much worse. In a year, it could be much, much worse in the US. Trump's all odds favorite. I don't see how, people are discounting him again. They discounted him last time. So I guess you're in a real growth area, business wise. There's going to be huge demand for people like yourself and groups like yourself. So I guess that's not really questions, but how do you like there's two things you can do. You can just kind of accept what's going on, not try to change things, realize that you can't change things as an individual, right? So not be worried about outcomes as you're talking about. But on the other hand, if enough people got enraged at what they see happening, or enraged at, say, Trump, for example, why isn't the guy in jail? How can he possibly be US president again? He's saying he'll turn it into an autocracy day one. There probably won't be any further elections in the US. So how can people in the country see this happening and not be out on the streets protesting every day and getting him disqualified, getting charges sticking on him? Like, it's become so political. It's like half the country's cheering him on, maybe not half, but a third, and then another third of the country is totally against him, and then the other third they've just shut off. They don't give a hoot. So there's a line between, should we be trying to do something, or should we just accept that all hell's breaking loose? And climate, I mean, if the projections of James Hansen are correct, the rate of climate increase, global warming, is doubling over the next decade or so. We're basically at 1.5. We're going to be at 2, 10, 15 years. We're going to have global food shortages, right? As extreme weather takes off. This is all coming, and it's like, okay, well, I mean, I talk about it all the time, but it doesn't seem to, make much difference. So that's being not connected to the outcome is crucial to allow a person to stay sane and do their work. So I don't know. I've said enough. I don't know if I've asked any questions. How about the U in your name? It's kind of cool. I like it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been writing my name like this since I was young, and I love the model that people like Bell Hooks have given us about being able to manipulate the English language and, play with different types of capitalizations. I think that even at the most subtle level, we can start dismantling business as usual, and this is one way that I can do it. And I can capitalize the U as it's been written, and I can offset my name, which is a super common name. So you see my name and you're going to be like, I know who that person is. And also at the same time, I can be like, I don't have to follow your rules. I think these systems are not suitable for us. And to speak to what you're saying, Paul, this is why I like Trevi's definition of acceptance so much is like, yeah, we can accept that Trump's a viable candidate, but also we ought to be doing everything in our power so that he doesn't get reelected, and it goes back to this thing that both you and I mentioned of like letting go of outcomes. Like, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be great if we all took to the streets and said, we're going to completely stop using fossil fuels right now and figure out what we need to do to build back better. We're not going to allow fascists or authoritarians to come to power. Like, if we could all do those kinds of things, we'd be in a better place. And yet we've seen time and time again that people don't engage in those types of ways. I mean, we have seen it, we've seen 300,000 people show up for the climate march. We've seen people rallying right now in support of Palestine. Like, we have seen these social movements, but how do we get people to actually stand up and take back our agency? And I think that this is so much why the inner work is important, is so many of us feel agentless, like nothing we do matters, like the systems are all too big and we can't have a say or a voice in them. And maybe that's partly true, but does that mean we stop trying? Like, I really, really believe in systems theory and that we're all fractals, and the things that we do, this conversation here matters because maybe it's lighting a fire in one of you to go do something else, and then you go off and do something. And so I'm really relying more on grassroots and bottom up than I am top down. And it also makes me think a lot about death anxiety and terror management theory, and the fact that we are all living in terror. Like, we all are just allowing our fear responses to win. And when we don't do the inner work to acknowledge that we're scared, we can do really horrible things to each other, and it increases othering and it increases bigotry. And so the fact that there's a big proportion of people who are following Trump, despite Trump being incredibly racist, incredibly sexist, like just an overall deeply wounded and wounding human being, is because he plays on our fear responses and he gives us this false sense of security. And when we feel often insecure, many of us are going to follow the guy who says, I've got the answers, I'm going to fix everything, I'm going to do these things, because it's easier to follow somebody like that than have to do our own work and acknowledge the liminality and the fear and the unpredictableness that you brought up. These projections of climate are absolutely terrifying, and it's easier to not give into that terror and instead project it onto somebody else.
I'm
Thank you.
going to, time is running low here, and I'm going to say that Art is on deck and Jean has the floor. Lilith has left. Go ahead, Jean.
Thank you. And I will say that please read the chat, because what Lilith said, it was more of a comment, but it was something that you should read in particular, because he's quite a thinker on a lot of these issues. And so read his comment in the chat, if you would, please. Anyway, my question is, in light of all the things that have been happening over the last few years, heat domes and droughts and forest fires and floods and all of the things that are going on that we now know have been caused by major climate change and what's going on, have you seen an increase in the number of people who are coming to you for aid? And how much of an increase have you actually seen?
Yes, indeed. We have seen an increase. And, when we were starting in 2016, I think it felt really fringy. I think a lot of people were like, oh, you weirdos talking about your grief. And shortly after that, Trump was elected. And so I think that kind of set many of us back who were not expecting him to be elected here in the United States. And then after that was the 2019 wildfires in Australia that just like ripped through the country. Of course, the United States has been on fire. Canada's been on fire. And so those types of things are making it more less and less easy to ignore the climate impacts. And I think it's becoming more normalized that the overwhelm and the isolation that we're feeling, like we can't keep going this way. And we at Good Grief Network don't have a very big marketing budget. We actually don't have a marketing budget at all. So we can't go and reach out, when communities have been impacted. We just rely on word of mouth, or we rely on people to do an internet search and find us so that they can meet with us. But yeah, it again, like, 2016, I think a lot of people thought we were a bit foolish for meeting and talking about these kinds of things. And I think now so many of us are looking for spaces to come and to connect and to have a space to name our fears and our griefs and our despair and hopelessness. And like, we just need a place to acknowledge our feelings. And I don't know if you're like me, my family and my friend group, still aren't particularly supportive of talking about these kinds of things, because climate or systemic issues in generally don't make polite table conversation. Like, you're often like, oh, there's LaUra being the downer of the group again, talking about plastics in our bones and plastic in the geologic record. And, like, the heat domes and the wildfire, you know, like you're always the person that brings down the party, and yet these things need to be said. And so we need to be cultivating spaces. And if it's not good grief, you know, maybe it's the collapse aware space. It's like all these spaces need to be cultivated and have places for us to bring our heart and our minds and our worries to.
If I have a bit of a follow-up on this, do you provide your services or your things by over the internet mostly, and especially after COVID and the use of Zoom and other programs similar to that? So it's all been done online?
Yes, we are predominantly online right now. Yeah, I would love to get back and have a hybrid model. Like we're building a membership program right now where we have lots of different types of offerings. And so you can kind of engage with what interests you. What I would love is for you to, you know, search your city in the membership program, and then you would have a list of events that are coming up for the next week that are both in person and online. We're not there yet. We're a few years away from being able to actualize something like that. But right now we are mostly digital. However, we've trained a lot of facilitators, and we are hoping that they'll bring it back into their community spaces or their book clubs or their church groups or wherever they're meeting in person, and developing those relationships and having these kinds of conversations locally.
Thank you. Very, very
Thank you.
interesting talk. Thank you very much, LaUra.
Yeah, thank you.
And Fernande
Yes.
Faulkner is on deck, but first Art has the floor for his question. Comment.
Yeah, Laura, I was really interested in what you've had to say, because I just touched on it a little bit. Personally, by happenstance, I didn't set off with this in mind, but as you may or may not be aware, I run a fossil fuel-free lifestyle. I generate my own power and have ground source heat pumps and lots of hardware and software and electric vehicles and all that. And I was, you know, motivated to do this. Number one, I have the skills that allow me to do that, and I made a suitable financial arrangement. And but the first time that we had a power outage that was a few days long, because I was there, I became the hub, the community hub. People showed up to charge their telephones. They were the first people. Then people were coming over and saying, geez, what can I do? I don't have any electricity. My refrigerator's going on. And other people saying, my sump pump isn't working. So the next thing you know, I'm plugging extension cords in and running them over to neighbors across the road and doing all that. And the other phenomena was people would come there and just to hang out in my garage, to talk about their experience and say, look, I got this, I got that. And they're starting to behave like a community, whereas, you know, up until there was a little disaster, it was little more than, you know, a chat on the side of the road as I'm walking the dog, you know. And but now the community is a lot better. It was the disasters or the little problems that caused this to naturally happen. And I thought about this a bit and recall when there's back in 1998 we had an ice storm where parts of the city were without power for 3 weeks, and some farms were without power for 6 weeks, and this is a major issue, milking the cows and all that. But their communities grew. Their leaders came out of nowhere, and I don't think there was a big death rate or anything major that came out of it. You know, the stores opened up and they they would take your credit card and write it down on a piece of paper, so you could still buy things. The banks are closed, There was a lot of things which people hadn't thought about. And this really leads to a question to you, because you've been in this space a lot longer than I have, and have experienced and communicated with many people on the issue. Have you seen anything of this natural, what I call a natural phenomenon, where communities get together without any prior practice or prior agreement or what have you? It's the mere fact that there is a common element of survival, that they realize that they do not have all the necessary skills and what have you to do that. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Great question. I have two thoughts, one of which is that Rebecca Solnit has written about this in a book called Paradise Built in Hell, this phenomenon that a lot of times we think when disasters happen, we all sort of fragment and, become in conflict with each other. And she actually has highlighted a handful of cases where people did actually come together and work together. So that's my first thing, is the recommendation about this book. The criticism that I've heard a lot from this book is that all of these disasters are kind of one-offs. It's like Hurricane Katrina, a very big disaster, but it was like one thing. And then, of course, other climate events. But what happens with this community mindset when we're in constant crisis, when there's constant storms, when there's constant food scarcity? And so I am entertaining those kinds of things. And I think that's where the trust building and relationship building and connections really matter. And then the second part escaped me because my mind is not very clear. So I had something else profound to say, but I've since forgotten it. My apologies. But the book recommendation stands. Rebecca Solnit, Paradise Built in Hell.
Okay, thank you.
And I think our last question will be Fernande
Yes,
Faulkner. So go
Right.
ahead, you have the floor.
yes. It's not a question. First of all, I want to say my appreciation for your talk, because you're right into, it's so important for us to build ourselves, resource ourselves, build communities in order to, in a more public sphere, contribute. So that is a very good message. Also, and I guess I want to share my experience, so at a personal level, which is that here in Vancouver, when I came here, under the aegis of the city, there are different dance programs, and I have joined a few of them, and one of them is dancing in the heart of the East Side with the homeless and the First Nation. And this was such a rich experience where we shared stories and heard their stories, and we shared, Indigenous people shared their dance steps and the music, and all together we developed a choreography, and we had live musicians, and so this was sort of a reconciliation exercise of really listening to each other and participating in the creation of something and building a community that exists at least on those days that we meet. I'm in another group that is taking Emily Carr and her paintings and being inspired to develop choreographies on the forest, one of which I'm working on now, and then sharing that. Basically, these groups don't really aim for an outcome or a performance, but over time we've learned to share them with select audiences like other elders, children, and to invite them to think about the forest and to act out some of the movements. So that's where I'm engaged right now. And I think it's been so, I never thought that I would be dancing at my age. I never really danced much before, but I got into it, and it's it's I'm so grateful. I'm grateful that that my body allows me to do it. I'm grateful for the community that we built, and I'm grateful for the uplift that it brings. So, and that is the resourcing that is, that helps me address the tension between the personal and then a wish for outcome. I follow the COP28 very closely, so I feel all the tensions and wish for a resolution and a push for certain outcomes. I'm in there. So that's what I wanted to share at a very personal level.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you don't have a comment, LaUra, I will tell you that I remember in your book, you have a line that that stuck in my mind. It was very moving, that we have to learn to dance on the way down.
Yeah, that's a direct quote from Amy Lewis Rowe. She was talking about how she constantly feels like the rug's being pulled out from beneath her and that she can't find steady ground anywhere. And then she kind of shrugged and she said, well, guess I better learn how to dance while falling. Like that's the new norm.
There we go. There we go.
Yep.
So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ted with our official thanks.
LaUra, that was wonderful. That got us, I think it's got us talking a number of things that many of us had never thought of. I just have a couple of quick reactions first that I didn't get a chance to throw at you. You may respond if you wish, but it strikes me that we are now so electronically linked that we can see disasters in all directions every 10 minutes if we wish. That never happened before. A few decades ago, you had to go to the 6 o'clock news and you might see one disaster. Now it's available to you several minutes every day and anytime you wish. Another observation was that each life is unique. Each person has their own take. And the question I'd like addressed at some point in future is, how do we get people actually to seek new concepts and ideas to help them to respond? Many don't. Many just hunker down in their own padded silos and hope it'll all go away. And one other thing, that just to add where it fits in some of the stuff the Club of Rome is doing, we are trying carefully to define what we really mean by well-being, the attitudes, the concepts, and the ideas, really to counter the concept of just growth and more, but look instead at what real people mean when they talk about their own well-being, their own futures, and the hope that they might have one. So all of those thoughts were stimulated by your excellent presentation. I much appreciate that. So I would like to thank you on behalf of K-Core and of the other people who are here, and you definitely gave us fodder for further discussion, and maybe we can invite you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for those of you who do not belong to K-Core and its Zoom, it is all of the advertising is on your screen. And we would ask those of you who do not belong, please join us. And those of you who wish to see the YouTubes and to give us a little bit of support, please subscribe to the YouTubes. It doesn't hurt the advertising we do for these excellent events. So thank you again and have a great week.